The fourth big takeaway of this little experiment, this little Hello World application, was how we were able to create a view and how we were able to utilize the scaffolded layout page for that view. And I think that this deserves a little more explanation, so I wanted to spend a little time here. Inside of the view, we noted how the Razor syntax is used for presentation logic. When I use the word presentation logic, I mean any C# code that's required to accurately portray model values to the end user. So I may need to format data differently if it's within a certain range or outside of a certain range. Here we've used a looping structure in order to list many items inside of our model and so on. So that's presentation logic. So Razor is one of two different view engines that you use for presentation logic, at least two that are provided by Microsoft. Two different styles of syntax for defining a view. The Razor view engine is immediately recognizable because of its copious use of that @ symbol everywhere and how it is syntax highlighted whenever you're in the CS/HTML page editor. In the very next lesson, I'm going to tell you, actually not in the next lesson, but a couple of lessons from now, I'm going to tell you everything that you're going to need to know about the syntax rules of Razor. For the most part, it's extremely obvious. However, there are a few gotchas, and we'll talk about those. But I do want to impress upon you one thing about the ASP.NET MVC framework, that you have complete control over the HTML that's emitted from the framework. And this is in sharp contrast to ASP.NET Web Forms, which encapsulate the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript required for a given feature of the web page in web server controls. Now, think about your own experience with using web server controls. You may have found it difficult sometimes to get the styling and the functionality you needed in a web server control because those little guys are black boxes and you don't have any visibility inside of them. They're compiled and you really don't know how things are being implemented. It just spits out all this HTML for you, okay? Now, at some point in ASP.NET's illustrious history, web forms began to feel very heavy because it attempted to make web development really easy for those who had no web development experience before. We're talking way back in the year 2000, 2001, and we're talking about Microsoft trying to get users who were familiar with working with Visual Basic 6 and creating, those battleship gray forms with buttons and dragging controls over and data binding them. They wanted the VB6 people to convert over to .NET and have a similar experience. So it was the web forms was intended to mimic the Windows Forms experience. You could leverage your knowledge of one and know what you're doing with the other for the most part. So, the downside of that approach was you had all this hard stuff abstracted away from the developer, which seemed like a good idea at first, but the problem was you had no real visibility into the inner workings of the ASP.NET Web Forms framework. Things just seemed to happen by magic and you really couldn't plug into it except at some very specific spots. Now, as it turned out, without visibility into the framework, without visibility into the implementation of the web server controls, developers began to make poor decisions. And one great example of this is view state. And people would just stick stuff in view state, view state, view state. There were server controls by third parties. I won't name any names here, but these companies would just naively throw everything that they needed to throw into the view state. And before long, a couple of controls doing this, you would have view state that was pages and pages and pages long, just for the view state, not for all the other HTML for the web page. And so clearly things at some point got out of control. With that much code being transferred over the internet, first of all, to read in all that view state, parse it, create objects as a result of it, that slowed down the web server, and then that much code being transferred over the internet, well, across slow networks anyway, everything was grinding to a halt. So that's just a little example of the fact that ASP.NET web forms did a lot of things for you automatically, and it seemed to be great because you didn't have to think about them. It did lead to some poor decisions because those little mechanisms that were created were stretched way beyond their original intent. So the MVC framework provides more control over the HTML that's emitted, and that's what real professionals desire. One of the things that you get with more control over the emitted HTML is easier integration with popular JavaScript frameworks, which were coming into vogue about that time that MVC was originally released in 2007, 2008. At that time, it was easier to harness JavaScript with frameworks like jQuery, using ASP.NET MVC than with web forms. More recently, JavaScript frameworks like Knockout.js and the very popular Angular.js are able to integrate more easily with the MVC framework because you have complete control over the HTML that's output. You also have more control to work with CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, for example. And that brings us to kind of the next point that I wanted to talk about. I want to focus on the layout, the underscore layout .cshtml page, and you can see that we talked about this. By default, the layout page provided some simple aesthetic design using Bootstrap classes and Bootstrap techniques. So here's an example of scaffolding and how it was used kind of at a project level to provide some good out-of-the-box functionality that we can tweak and enhance on our own. Now, I didn't point that out at the time when we originally were talking about this, but you can see the file name is obviously prefixed with an underscore layout.cshtml, and there's also an underscore viewstart.cshtml file. Is that significant? Yes, it was significant. It's less significant today. It's going to require a little bit of an explanation. So in order to kind of illustrate how all this works, just keep in mind this folder structure. In the root of our project, there's a views folder, and in the views folder, there's two subfolders, home and shared, and then there's also this underscore viewstart.cshtml file. In the shared folder, obviously the underscore layout CSHTML, in the home folder, the index.cshtml file. Now, we already noted that whenever we're working with web forms, we can simply just access the file directly by typing in the URL. So let's bring this over here. So if we wanted to go to a specific page, regardless of what folder it was in, we just have to type in the URL and we would get there. So that's great for web forms. What about MVC? Well, what if we went to views/underscore viewstart CSHTML? You can see I've done this a couple of times. We get a 404 error. Wait, what? It's right there. Why can't we get to it? There must be something stopping us. Let's try the /views/shared/underscore layout.cshtml. Nope, we get another 404. Can't get to that file either. Well, maybe that's just the underscores. Maybe that doesn't apply if we were to go views/home/index.cshtml. No, can't get there either. What gives? Well, I think that it's important to understand that there's a fundamental difference in how incoming requests are routed to web forms versus how they're routed through ASP.NET MVC, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But the takeaway from this little exercise is that you can't directly access files in an ASP.NET MVC application. There's something about the runtime that's stopping the access of those files and those folder contents. Now, I already kind of showed you that it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with these underscores, that we weren't able to get to this index either. So what's with the underscores? Well, this has to do with how the Razor syntax was originally intended to be used. It was developed for a technology that was called ASP.NET Web Pages. Not web forms, not MVC. It was web pages, and you could create ASP.NET Web Pages with a tool called Web Matrix. I'm not even sure that it's available anymore. I think they retired Web Pages and Web Matrix. But it was considered to be an entry point for beginners that were becoming familiar with ASP.NET and C#. And I never really latched onto it because it didn't make sense, you know, and from my way of thinking, unless you're an absolute hobbyist and you have no aspirations beyond that, why would you want to touch it? I mean, most companies are going to either use web forms or MVC. So the ASP.NET web pages followed a classic ASP model of execution, like PHP does, where it's very simple. It starts at the top and works its way down. And I don't want to get into the particulars of that, but it's understood to be a little bit easier to understand than writing web forms or ASP.NET MVC. And you are able to access, just like you were with web forms, any file in any folder, which posed a problem. What if you didn't want people to look at certain files, like certain view files, the templates for ASP.NET web pages? Well, in order to address that, the developers at Microsoft said, well, if you prefix the file name with an underscore, then you won't be able to navigate to that file. Okay, fair enough. So since ASP.NET web pages was intended to be kind of a precursor to ASP.NET MVC, like an entry point, then they wanted to make that transition from web pages to MVC very easily. So they kept some of these decisions, like the underscore layout, underscore view start. Both of those files were part of web pages, apparently. I never used it, so I don't know. However, today with ASP.NET MVC, it doesn't matter. You just simply can't navigate to a specific file in a specific folder. I guess the moral of the story is that, yes, there's a technical reason why the underscores exist. However, it's just not relevant anymore to MVC applications. They don't follow that convention. Now that ASP.NET Web Pages is kind of gone, this really is just one of those relics that are left over from an originally good idea that had a good purpose, but now it's just the way you do things. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about the nature of a view, and then also the nature of these layout pages and what's the deal with the underscore. And we're going to come back to the view in the very next lesson and explore this a little bit more and talk about the helper methods, like this helper method here and this method here and things of that nature. Okay, we'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks.